The shell strikes the turret with a sound like thunder trapped inside a steel drum. Shrapnel tears through the fighting compartment in less than a heartbeat. The tank commander feels his left leg separate from his body below the knee. He does not scream. There is no time to scream. His hands find the hatch rim by instinct alone, and he pulls himself upward through smoke and the copper smell of blood, dragging the smoking stump of what used to be his leg across the engine deck. 120 meters away, hidden in the shadow of Cologne Cathedral, the German Panther that just killed his crew is already searching for its next target. This is the story of what happened next. This is the story of the tank duel at Cologne Cathedral, one of the only armoured engagements of the Second World War captured on motion picture film, and the 74-year journey of the gunner who avenged his fallen comrades that afternoon. The tank at the centre of this story was a T26E3 Pershing, one of only 20 such vehicles in all of Europe in March of 1945. It carried the designation Eagle 7, named for its unit marking E7, indicating the 7th vehicle of Easy Company, 32nd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division. This machine represented everything American tank crews had been demanding since the hedgerows of Normandy, a weapon that could finally meet German armour on equal terms. Its crew of 5 men had been hand-picked for this experimental vehicle because they possessed a flawless combat record. They had never had their tank knocked out. They had fought together since September of 1944, surviving ambushes, urban combat, and the frozen nightmare of the Ardennes offensive. The Pershing weighed approximately 46 tons and carried a 90mm M3 gun with a barrel length of 53 calibers. This weapon could fire its T-33 armor-piercing round at 853 meters per second, penetrating approximately 122 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. For the first time in the war, American tankers possessed a gun that could punch through the frontal armor of a Panther tank at combat ranges. The Pershing's own frontal protection measured 102 millimeters on the upper glacis plate, angled at 46 degrees. Its turret mantlet measured approximately 114 millimeters thick. This was roughly double the protection of a standard Sherman tank, and it represented the first American armored vehicle that could potentially survive a frontal hit from the Panther's fearsome 75mm gun. The story of how this tank reached the streets of Cologne began with a bitter debate that had cost American lives throughout the European campaign. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, had championed the tank destroyer doctrine, the theory that tanks existed to support infantry while specialized tank destroyers handled enemy armor. In the fall of 1943, McNair wrote that there could be no basis for the T-26 tank other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel, which he believed was unsound and unnecessary. Tank crews fighting Panther tanks with inadequate Shermans paid the price for this doctrine with their lives. General Jacob Devers, commanding the armoured force, disagreed so strongly that he went over McNair's head directly to General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall overruled McNair in December of that same year and authorized the development of the heavy tank. McNair himself was killed by friendly fire during Operation Cobra in July of 1944, but his doctrine continued to influence American armored operations for the remainder of the war. The irony was bitter. The man who had opposed the development of the Pershing died in Normandy, where American tank crews were being slaughtered by the very Panther tanks the Pershing was designed to defeat. Even after Marshall's authorization, production and logistical delays meant only 20 T-26E3 Pershings reached Europe by February of 1945. They arrived under the Zebra technical mission led by Major General Gladian Barnes, shipped to Antwerp, and then transported to a maintenance facility near Aachen. The Zebra mission was essentially a combat evaluation program, designed to test the new tank under actual battlefield conditions against German armor. The 20 Pershings were distributed among units of the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions, with crews specifically selected for their combat experience and tactical skill. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final decisive phase. The Battle of the Bulge had exhausted Germany's last strategic reserves. Allied forces were pushing toward the Rhine from multiple directions. The capture of Cologne fell under Operation Lumberjack, launched by the United States First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges to clear the west bank of the Rhine. The principal assault force was the 3rd Armoured Division, known by its nickname Spearhead, commanded by Major General Maurice Rose. The 104th Infantry Division, called the Timberwolves, pressed from the west, while the 9th Armoured Division cleared southern sectors alongside the 9th Infantry Division. Cologne itself was a skeleton of its former self. Germany's fourth largest city had endured 262 separate Royal Air Force bombing raids that dropped more than 34,700 long tons of bombs over the course of the war. The last raid had struck on March 2, 1945, just 4 days before the events of this story. Only an estimated 20,000 civilians remained among the rubble from a pre-war population of roughly 800,000 souls. The twin spires of the Cologne Cathedral, the great Gothic masterpiece completed in 1880 after more than 600 years of construction, still rose above the devastation. They were blackened and charred, but structurally intact, despite 14 direct bomb hits during the air campaign. Those spires had ironically served as a navigational landmark for Allied bombers throughout the war, their distinctive silhouette visible from miles away. Defending Cologne were the remnants of 3 battered German divisions, the 9th Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, and the 363rd Volksgrenadier Division, supplemented by Volkssturm militia armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers. Most critically, Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle had deployed around Cologne from February of 1945 with a dwindling force of Panther tanks. Perhaps 24 German tanks of all types remained to defend the entire city. Nazi Gauleiter Joseph Groh had already fled across the Rhine by boat on the night of March 5th, abandoning the city he had publicly declared would be defended to the last cartridge. The 3rd Armoured Division's final push on Cologne began at 0700 hours on March 5, 1945. Eagle 7 led one column of the advance, with 3 M4 Shermans trailing behind. The tanks and accompanying infantry fought through western districts for the rest of the day, clearing buildings with main gunfire and machine guns. By nightfall, they had pushed deep into the ruined city. On the morning of March 6th, the advance resumed at first light. Eagle 7's orders were to reach the Rhine and the Hohenzollern Bridge, which American intelligence believed was still standing. The column pushed through Venloer Strasse, Friesenplatz, and Zeughausstrasse toward the city centre, grinding past mountains of rubble and the burned-out shells of apartment buildings. The crew inside Eagle 7 that morning represented one of the 3rd Armoured Division's most experienced tank teams. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, the commander, was born March 30th, 1915, in Fountain, Minnesota. At 29 years old, he was the crew's elder statesman. Early had fought since Normandy and was regarded as one of the best tank commanders in the regiment. He had an instinct for positioning and a cool head under fire that his men trusted completely. Corporal Clarence Smoyer, the gunner, was born June 25, 1923, in Perryville, Pennsylvania, and raised in Lehighton in the coal country of Carbon County. Tall and lean with curly blonde hair and blue eyes, Smoyer came from a German-American family. He had dropped out of high school in his sophomore year to help support his family during hard times and had never been in a fistfight in his life. Drafted in 1943 at age 19, he trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky. During gunnery competition in England before deployment, he hit his target all 8 times and scored highest in his entire unit, revealing a natural gift for the work. Despite this talent, he initially preferred the loader's position because killing Germans did not appeal to him given his heritage. He moved to the gunner's seat through attrition as crew members were lost and replaced. By March of 1945, he was the only original member of his crew still serving on Eagle 7. Private First Class John DeRiggi, the loader, hailed from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Technician 5th grade William McVeigh, the driver, came from Jackson, Michigan. His split-second decisions behind the controls would prove critical in the moments ahead. Private Homer Davis, nicknamed Smokey, served as radio operator and bow gunner. He came from Moorhead, Kentucky. Before the famous Cathedral duel, a devastating human tragedy unfolded on Christophstrasse, roughly a kilometre west of the cathedral. Around 11 in the morning, Eagle 7 encountered a German Panzer IV at a 4-way intersection. The Panzer IV, part of Panzer Brigade 106, had crossed the Hohenzollern Bridge that morning and was heading toward the Gerion freight station. The hull gunner of the German tank, a young soldier named Gustav Schaefer, opened fire with his machine gun on suspected American positions. As the 2 tanks faced off across the intersection, a black Opel sedan with civilian license plates drove directly into the crossfire. The driver was Michael Delling, a local grocery store owner. His passenger was Katharina Esser, his 26-year-old employee, born March 22, 1918. Both the Pershing's 30-caliber machine gun and the German machine gun fired on the vehicle, as both crews mistook the civilian car for a military or staff vehicle. Delling was killed instantly. Katharina was severely wounded by gunfire but survived the initial impacts. Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates, advancing with the troops, captured the horrifying sequence on film. Approximately an hour later, when American troops advanced to her position, medics applied emergency bandages to her wounds. Katharina Esser was the youngest of 4 sisters. All 3 of her older sisters had married, and all 3 of their husbands were killed during the war. She lost 3 brothers-in-law to the conflict. Kathy, as her family called her, never married. She had stayed home to care for her aging parents and frequently looked after her nieces and nephews. She took night classes in home economics, hoping to become a teacher after the war ended. In one of her last letters to her family, she wrote that life only had sad things to offer nowadays, and that she did not believe in a good outcome anymore. She was buried in a mass grave at Friedhof St. Gerion in Cologne, marked only with a knee-high wooden cross reading, "The Unknown Dead." Her identity remained unknown for more than 60 years, until journalist Hermann Reindorf identified her through careful analysis of the Signal Corps film footage. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, a massive explosion echoed across the city. German engineers from Panzer Brigade 106 had destroyed the Hohenzollern Bridge, sending a column of black smoke billowing between the cathedral's twin spires. The bridge that had survived years of Allied bombing raids was gone in seconds, demolished by the very army that was supposed to defend it. While Eagle 7 was halted on Christophstrasse dealing with the aftermath of the civilian tragedy, the initiative shifted to Fox Company, 32nd Armoured Regiment, advancing on a parallel street called Komödienstrasse, heading east toward the cathedral. 2 Shermans pushed forward through the rubble. The lead tank, an M4A1 with a 76mm gun and wet ammunition stowage, was commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Karl Kellner. Kellner was born November 29, 1918, in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, the son of Edmund and Cecilia Kellner, whose parents had emigrated from southern Germany. He had completed high school by 1940, was drafted on June 13, 1941, and had risen from private to a battlefield commission as 2nd Lieutenant, received only about 2 weeks before the Cologne battle. Despite his recent promotion, Kellner was no novice. He had already been wounded twice in combat and earned the Silver Star for valor during the Normandy campaign. The 2 Shermans reached Komödienstrasse near the intersection with Andreaskloster, approximately 120 meters from the cathedral square. A massive pile of rubble blocked the road ahead. They called for a bulldozer tank and waited in the street. A group of reporters and photographers accompanied the column, including Jim Bates of the 165th Photo Signal Company and Sergeant Andy Rooney, the Stars and Stripes correspondent who would later become famous on the television program 60 Minutes. The trap was already set. A German Panther from 2nd Company, Panzer Battalion 2106, Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle, lay in ambush ahead. Its commander was 1st Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, an experienced tank officer who held the Honor Roll clasp of the Army, a distinguished decoration for exceptional valor. The Panther was positioned in or near the Trankgas tunnel beneath Cologne's central train station, invisible to the approaching Shermans from a distance of approximately 340 meters. The Hohenzollern Bridge had been blown behind Bartelborth's crew just hours earlier. They could not retreat across the Rhine. They would fight where they stood. 2 75mm shells from the Panther's long-barreled gun tore into Kellner's Sherman turret in rapid succession. The impact points were within inches of each other, a display of exceptional gunnery under pressure. The shells sent shrapnel tearing through the turret and hull, killing Driver Private First Class Julian Patrick instantly. Patrick was born April 29, 1921, in Magoffin County, Kentucky, the youngest of 4 brothers, all serving in the war. The loader, technician 5th grade Curtis Spear, died beside him. Kellner's left leg was severed below the knee by the blast. Signal Corps cameras captured him crawling out of the commander's hatch, the stump of his leg visibly smoking, still gripping a rifle that he dropped as he slid off the engine deck and fell to the cobblestones below. Corporal John Gianluca, the 19-year-old turret gunner, was pinned by shrapnel through his legs but blasted free by the second impact. He pulled himself through the commander's hatch and jumped headfirst from the turret. The bow gunner, Oliver Griffin, also escaped with wounds. A third 75mm shell struck the second Sherman's right track, disabling it, and that crew abandoned their vehicle quickly. Andy Rooney, a medic, and other soldiers rushed to Kellner's side under fire. They carried him to a bomb crater near the burning Sherman and attempted to apply a tourniquet to the shattered remnant of his leg. Rooney reportedly held Kellner in his arms as he died. Kellner was 26 years old. He had commanded his Sherman for approximately 8 days. After firing, the Panther moved forward from the tunnel area to the intersection at Marzellenstrasse, roughly 220 meters closer to the American lines, its gun barrel still oriented down Komödienstrasse, watching for more targets to present themselves. The situation was now a standoff. No surviving Sherman on that street could hope to engage the Panther frontally with any chance of success. Easy Company's column, including Eagle 7, was positioned on a parallel street to the north in the Gerionstrasse area when radio chatter crackled with news of the Sherman's destruction. Jim Bates climbed onto Eagle 7's turret and told Staff Sergeant Robert Early that a Panther was sitting in the Cathedral Square just one street over. Early understood immediately what needed to be done. He and Bates went forward on foot into the contested zone between the lines, ducking into the German Labour Front building on the corner of An den Dominikanen and Marzellenstrasse. From the mezzanine windows, they had a clear line of sight south down Marzellenstrasse toward the cathedral. And there sat the Panther, its gun barrel still pointed down Komödienstrasse toward the destroyed Shermans. They were looking directly at its exposed flank. Early saw his opportunity immediately, a classic flanking attack. He returned to Eagle 7 and briefed his crew on what he had seen. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. Drive south along An den Dominikanen and pull into the Marzellenstrasse intersection just far enough to fire into the Panther's side before it could traverse its gun to meet them. Bates stayed in the Labour Front building, set up his 16mm motion picture camera on the mezzanine railing, and waited. He later recalled that he sat there and it seemed like forever for them to get started. He was getting impatient and stepped out momentarily. He thinks the German tank saw him, because it started to turn its turret around. About that time, he heard the American tank coming up the street. The distance between the two tanks when Eagle 7 entered the intersection was approximately 110 meters. Eagle 7 advanced south along An den Dominikanen, emerging from the shadow of the Commerzbank building into the open intersection. As it edged into view of Marzellenstrasse, radio operator Homer Davis, seated in the front right hull, was the first to see the Panther. He was also the first to stare down the barrel of its 75mm gun. Bartelborth, experienced enough to sense danger approaching, had already begun traversing his turret toward the intersection where he had spotted movement moments earlier. But then came the moment that decided everything. Bartelborth did not recognize the Pershing as an American tank. He had never seen nor heard of the M26 Pershing before this moment. Only about 20 existed in all of Europe, having arrived mere weeks earlier. His daughter later recounted in the documentary Cologne 1945 Close-Ups that her father told the family he believed the approaching tank was German. He told his gunner to hold fire. That hesitation was fatal. Driver McVeigh, watching the Panther's turret begin its traverse through his periscope, made a decision that likely saved his entire crew. Rather than stopping, which would have made Eagle 7 a stationary target, McVeigh floored the accelerator and drove straight through the intersection, keeping the tank moving the entire time. Smoyer had been traversing Eagle 7's turret as they cleared the corner. The moment he saw center mass of the Panther in his gun sight, he fired the 90mm armor-piercing round while the tank was still in motion, before the Panther's gun was fully aimed at him. Bates later confirmed that Corporal Clarence Smoyer, the gunner, did not wait for his tank to stop, but fired before the enemy gun was aimed at him. The shell struck under the gun shield on the Panther's hull. The impact hole would be clearly visible in post-war photographs taken at the scene. With this first hit, Bartelborth and 3 of his crew members began abandoning the Panther immediately. One man's clothing was visibly aflame in the footage as he tumbled from the hatches. They fled under a hail of tracer fire from American infantry who had crept up alongside Eagle 7 during the approach. Derigi slammed another 90mm round into the breach within seconds. Eagle 7 had stopped now. Smoyer fired again, striking the turret ring area. In Bates's footage, the Panther's gunner, who was trapped deeper in the turret than the others, can be seen clawing his way out through the commander's hatch as the round struck. He was killed by the impact and slipped back into the burning hull of the tank. Smoyer fired a third and final round to ensure the Panther would never fire back. In his own words, years later, as they were moving, he fired once. Then they stopped, and he fired 2 more shells to make sure they would not fire at their side. All 3 shells penetrated, 1 under the gun shield and 2 on the side. The 2 side hits went completely through the Panther and out the other side. The total elapsed time from Eagle 7 entering the intersection to the third shot was approximately 48 seconds, all of it captured on Bates's camera. The Panther became a raging inferno within moments. Bright flames towered from the open hatches, and the penetration holes glowed orange with the heat of burning fuel and ammunition. Bates panned his camera outward to capture the twin spires of Cologne Cathedral rising above the burning German tank, producing one of the most iconic images of the entire Second World War. He then ran from the Labour Front building to Eagle 7 and shouted to Early that he thought he got it all on film. He asked the crew to stand in their hatches so he could capture them with the burning Panther in the background. A frame from this footage would later become the cover of Adam Marcos's best-selling book, Spearhead. Commander First Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth survived the engagement. He and 3 other crew members escaped the burning tank. The gunner, trapped deeper in the turret than the others, was killed when the second round struck. His body was found inside the Panther the next day when the fires finally subsided. At least 1 other crew member who escaped the tank died subsequently, possibly from his wounds in a hospital. The surviving crew members were captured by a group of policemen and Volkssturm members. During interrogation, they claimed they had intended to wait for the Pershing to stop before firing, a decision that, combined with Bartelborth's fatal hesitation in identifying the unknown tank, cost them the duel. Bartelborth lived to approximately age 93, but died before modern researchers could interview him extensively about that day. The Panther destroyed at Cologne was a variant A model, not the later variant G as sometimes assumed in popular accounts. Evidence for this identification includes the presence of Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste on the hull, which was discontinued before variant G production began, and a mantlet style without the variant G's characteristic chin guard designed to prevent shot traps. The tank belonged to 2nd Company, Panzer Battalion 2106, Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle. Post-war photographs show the Panther's burned-out hulk sitting in the intersection for some time after the battle, with curious civilians and soldiers examining the damage. The 3 penetration holes from Smoyer's 90mm rounds were clearly visible in these images. The engagement at Cologne provided a devastating visual lesson in why the Pershing mattered to the American war effort. Within the span of a single afternoon, viewers of Bates's footage could watch a Panther destroy a Sherman, then watch a Pershing destroy that same Panther in retaliation. The contrast between the 2 engagements was stark and deliberate in its implications for anyone watching the newsreels back home. The M4 Sherman that Kellner commanded had been fundamentally overmatched against the Panther from the start. The Panther mounted a 75mm KWK-42 gun with a barrel length of 70 calibers, one of the finest tank guns of the entire war. This weapon could fire its standard armor-piercing round at 935 meters per second, penetrating approximately 124 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. Against the Sherman's frontal hull armor of only 51 to 63 millimeters, the Panther could achieve kills at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, well beyond the distance at which the Sherman could hope to return effective fire. Even the upgraded 76mm M1 gun mounted on Kellner's Sherman could not penetrate the Panther's frontal glacis armor at any practical combat range using standard armor-piercing ammunition. The Panther's glacis was 80mm thick, angled at 55 degrees from vertical, providing an effective thickness of approximately 139 millimeters. American tankers knew their Shermans were vulnerable. They had learned through bitter experience that frontal engagements with Panthers were a losing proposition. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had erupted in frustration in July of 1944, stating that ordnance had told him the 76mm gun would take care of anything the Germans had, and now he found it could not knock out a thing. Combat tests in Normandy confirmed that none of the standard American tank or anti-tank weapons could reliably defeat the Panther from the front. The only reliable method was flanking, which required maneuvering multiple Shermans into position while taking casualties, or calling in air support, which was not always available. The Pershing changed that equation entirely. Its 90mm gun could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at ranges where tank commanders could actually identify their targets. Technical Sergeant James Bates, the man who captured this historic footage, was born May 14, 1916, in Boulder, Colorado. His family moved to Colorado Springs in 1923, where his father worked as an aeronautical engineer. After high school, Bates spent 7 years as a cinematographer and director at the Alexander Film Company, which produced short advertisements for movie theaters. He enlisted in the Army in 1942 and was assigned to the Signal Corps. Bates served with the 165th Photo Signal Company, United States Army Signal Corps, attached to 1st Army and the 3rd Armored Division. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, he jumped into Normandy with paratroopers attached to the 82nd Airborne Division. He landed in a canal, carrying 150 pounds of equipment, soaking his camera gear and rendering it inoperable. He fought as a regular infantryman for the first 2 days before obtaining replacement gear. During the Battle of the Bulge, he rode aboard a tank, was given responsibility for its machine gun, and filmed combat footage while simultaneously operating the weapon, even after being wounded by enemy fire. At Cologne, Bates carried a small 16mm motion picture camera, the standard format for Signal Corps fieldwork. His filming position on the mezzanine of the German Labour Front building gave him an elevated angle, looking down the length of Marzellenstrasse toward the Cathedral Square. The concussion from Eagle 7's 90mm rounds shook him in his perch each time Smoyer fired, momentarily throwing off his aim. Despite this, he captured all 3 impacts, the crew evacuation, the burning Panther, and the cathedral spires in a continuous sequence of approximately 48 seconds. He received the Bronze Star for his combat camera work during the Cologne fighting. After the war, Bates filmed newsreel footage at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, married his English girlfriend Monica Howard in September of 1946, and returned to Colorado Springs. He died in 2002 at age 86. The aftermath of the Cologne battle carried its own bitter irony for Clarence Smoyer. Shortly after the engagement, he was notified that he would receive the Bronze Star for his actions that day. Days later, however, military police caught him giving bubble gum to German children who were begging at the roadside, a violation of the strict non-fraternization policy then in effect. The military police took his information and filed a report. The Bronze Star was rescinded. Tank Commander Early and cameraman Bates both received their Bronze Stars as planned. Smoyer received nothing for his role in the most famous tank duel of the war. He returned to Lehighton, Pennsylvania, after the war ended, and led a quiet life. He married Melba Whitehead of nearby Weisport, and they shared 71 years of marriage before her death in 2017. They had 2 daughters, Cynthia and Patricia, and a son named Barry. Smoyer was an avid bowler who loved roller skating and square dancing with his wife. He joined Lehighton American Legion Post 314. His neighbors in Allentown never knew they lived near a man who had fought in one of the most documented tank engagements in history. He seldom spoke of what happened in Cologne. He did not see the footage of his own engagement until 1996, when he received a videotape of a documentary about Jim Bates, produced by the Pikes Peak Library District. He said that when he first saw the film after all those years, it brought chills to his body. It took him right back to the awful feelings, all the bad stuff at once. It was author Adam Makos who discovered the Bronze Star discrepancy while researching his book Spearhead, An American Tank Gunner, His Enemy, and a Collision of Lives in World War II, published in 2019. The book reached number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list and remained on bestseller lists for months. Makos had previously written A Higher Call, about a German fighter pilot who spared an American bomber crew, and Devotion, about the friendship between 2 naval aviators during the Korean War. His approach to Spearhead combined meticulous archival research with extensive interviews of surviving participants and their families, creating a narrative that read like a novel while remaining grounded in documented historical fact. Makos presented Bates's combat footage and historical evidence to a military review board and campaigned successfully for the award's reinstatement after 7 decades. The campaign attracted national media attention, with stories appearing in newspapers and on television programs across the country. Veterans organizations rallied behind Smoyer's cause, arguing that a violation of a fraternization order should never have overridden recognition for exceptional valor in combat. The army agreed, and 74 years after the battle, justice was finally served. On September 18, 2019, Smoyer, then 96 years old, received the Bronze Star, with V device, for valor at a surprise ceremony at the National World War II Memorial in Washington. He had been told he was simply going to sign books at the Pentagon. When he arrived at the memorial and saw the crowd gathered, the Sherman tank on display, and the military officials waiting to honor him, he was overwhelmed with emotion. Army Major Peter Semenoff, also a Laheyton native, pinned the medal on his chest. Senator Pat Toomey spoke at the ceremony, praising Smoyer's courage and lamenting the decades of injustice he had endured. 3 posthumous Bronze Stars were simultaneously awarded to the other Eagle 7 crew members that day. Homer Davis's medal was accepted by his son Chuck. John DeRiggi's medal was accepted by his son John Jr. William McVeigh's medal was accepted by his son Jim. Robert Early, who had already received his Bronze Star during the war, was honored again posthumously at the ceremony. Perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of this story unfolded nearly 70 years after the battle itself. Cologne journalist Hermann Rheindorf had spent more than 20 years researching the events of March 6, 1945, searching Allied and German archives, identifying the faces in the Signal Corps footage frame by frame, and producing the landmark documentary Cologne 1945 Close-Ups. His meticulous work identified the American crew members by name, proved the identity of the German combatants through military records and family interviews, and finally uncovered the story of Katharina Esser, whose identity had been unknown for more than 6 decades. Rheindorf's documentary became an essential resource for anyone studying the battle, and his research laid the groundwork for Makos's later book. In 2013, Adam Marcos accompanied the elderly Smoyer on a journey back to Cologne. It was Smoyer's first return to the city since the war. At 89 years old, he walked with a cane but insisted on visiting every location he could remember from that day. They walked the exact streets where the battle had unfolded so many years before, from the Christophstrasse intersection where Katharina Esser was killed to the Cathedral Square where the Panther had burned. The rebuilt city bore little resemblance to the rubble-strewn wasteland of 1945, but Smoyer recognized certain landmarks, certain angles of sight, certain positions where he had crouched behind armor plating while bullets ricocheted off the hull. And there, in that rebuilt city, Smoyer met Gustav Schaefer, the German teenager who had served as bow gunner in the Panzer IV that exchanged fire with Eagle 7 on Christophstrasse, the engagement during which Katharina Esser was killed in the crossfire. Schaefer was now an old man himself, frail and grey-haired but still haunted by that day. Both men had lived with crushing guilt for nearly 70 years, each believing his burst of machine gun fire might have been the one that struck the young woman in that black Opel sedan. Neither man had ever spoken publicly about his guilt until Rheindorf's research brought them together. Smoyer extended his hand and said that the war is over, and now they can be friends. Schaefer responded simply in German, saying yes, good. Schaefer told Smoyer that he believed he might have been the one who shot her car. He had been firing at Smoyer. Smoyer had been firing at him. She drove through the middle of it. They still do not know which of their bullets struck her that morning. Hearing Gustav express his own burden of guilt lightened something in Smoyer that he had carried for 7 decades. Together, the 2 old soldiers visited the mass grave at Friedhof St. Gerion where Katharina Esser was buried. They placed yellow roses on her grave. Later, Smoyer lit a candle for her in Cologne Cathedral and spoke quietly, asking for her forgiveness if it was his shot that harmed her. Marcos also arranged a dinner with Esser's surviving relatives, including her niece Leni, then 83 years old, and family historian Mark Hieronymus. When asked if he blamed Smoyer for what happened to his aunt, Hieronymus paused before responding. He said that yes and no, and asked if there is really responsibility in a war like the Second World War, responsibility for the death of one person among so many. He did not think so. One of Esser's nieces looked directly at Smoyer and told him that the people who started this war are the ones who killed Katharina. Smoyer and Schaefer exchanged letters for the remaining years of Schaefer's life, 2 former enemies bound together by a shared tragedy and a mutual search for peace. Schaefer's final words to Smoyer were that in the next life, they would be comrades instead of enemies. Gustav Schaefer died in 2017. Clarence Smoyer sent flowers to his funeral in Germany, inscribed with the message that he would never forget him, signed as his brother in arms. The original Signal Corps footage is preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration under Record Group 111, Records of the Office of the Chief Signal Officer, which contains over 12,000 titles of Army motion pictures from the war. The footage was used in wartime newsreels, shown in theaters across America. In a Pennsylvania movie theater, Smoyer's sister-in-law recognized him on screen and cried out that it was Hon, the family nickname. She convinced the theater owners to replay the reel multiple times so Smoyer's parents, who had never been inside a movie theater before, could come and see with their own eyes that their son was still alive. Major General Maurice Rose, who had personally observed Smoyer's exceptional gunnery demonstrations during training and commanded the 3rd Armored Division through Cologne, was killed just 24 days after the Cathedral duel. On March 30, 1945, his jeep rounded a corner and came face to face with a German tank. Rose was shot attempting to surrender and became the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater. Clarence Smoyer died on September 30, 2022, at his home in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at age 99. He was the last surviving participant in the Cologne Cathedral tank duel from either side, American or German. He was buried with full military honors at Laheyton Cemetery in Carbon County, Pennsylvania, on October 6th of that year. The Cologne Cathedral tank duel endures not because it was the largest armored engagement of the war. It was not. Not because it was the most tactically significant either. An earlier engagement at Elsdorf, where a single Pershing destroyed 4 German tanks, including a Tiger I, was arguably more consequential to the campaign. The Cologne duel survives in our collective memory, because Jim Bates happened to be standing in the right building at the right moment with his 16mm camera rolling. He created visual proof of everything American tank crews had argued for years, that they needed a vehicle capable of meeting German armor on equal terms. In 48 seconds of silent film, one Panther destroyed a Sherman, and then one Pershing destroyed that same Panther. The entire arc of the American armor debate was rendered visible in a single afternoon of urban warfare. Yet the deepest resonance of this footage is human rather than mechanical. The frames capture Karl Kellner crawling from his shattered Sherman with the smoking stump of his severed leg trailing behind him. They capture a German gunner clawing desperately at a hatch as flames consume the fighting compartment around him. They capture the twin spires of a medieval cathedral rising above a burning tank in a city reduced to rubble by years of total war. Decades later, that same footage brought Clarence Smoyer and Gustav Schaefer together in Cologne. 2 old men placing yellow roses on the grave of the young woman both believed they might have killed, seeking forgiveness for an act of war that haunted them across a lifetime. The film preserves not just the machinery of war but its permanent human cost, frozen in silver halide, stored in archive boxes, and seared into the memory of everyone who watches it. Clarence Smoyer spent 74 years waiting for recognition that was taken from him for the simple act of giving candy to hungry children. When that recognition finally came in a ceremony at the National Mall, he did not speak of glory or triumph. He spoke of the faces he could not forget, the men he killed, the woman who died in the crossfire of a battle she never chose to join. He carried that weight until his final breath, just as Gustav Schaefer carried it, just as Wilhelm Bartelborth carried it into old age on the other side of the Atlantic. The twin spires of Cologne Cathedral still rise above the city today, exactly as they did on that March afternoon in 1945. The intersection where Eagle 7 faced the Panther has been completely rebuilt, transformed into a modern commercial district where tourists pass without knowing what happened on that ground 80 years ago. No formal memorial marks the spot where Kellner died or where the Panther burned. But the footage remains, preserved for future generations, played in documentaries, studied by historians, watched by millions who were not yet born when Clarence Smoyer pulled that trigger. Jim Bates climbed to the summit of Pikes Peak 40 times on New Year's Eve with the Adaman Club, his last ascent at age 79 in 1995. The footage he shot in Cologne outlived him by decades and will outlive everyone reading these words. It serves as testimony not to the superiority of one tank over another, but to the human beings who crewed those vehicles on both sides of the battlefield. Karl Kellner earned a battlefield commission and a Silver Star before he was 27 years old. Julian Patrick was the youngest of 4 brothers serving simultaneously in the war. He never made it home to Kentucky. Curtis Spear, the loader who died beside him, was just 21 years old. Wilhelm Bartelborth hesitated for a fraction of a second because he did not recognize the shape of the tank coming around the corner. That hesitation cost him his gunner's life and nearly cost him his own. He carried that decision with him for the rest of his days, just as Smoyer carried the memory of every round he fired. In the end, this story is not about which tank was superior or which crew reacted faster on that afternoon. It is about the price of war paid by everyone present, victor and vanquished alike. It is about a young woman named Katharina Esser who wanted to become a teacher and died in a crossfire she never saw approaching. It is about a tank commander named Karl Kellner who lost his leg and his life within sight of a cathedral that had survived centuries of European conflict. It is about a gunner named Clarence Smoyer who lived with guilt for 7 decades and finally found something like absolution in the handshake of the man he once tried to kill. That is why we remember. That is why the footage still matters after all these years. That is why the story of Eagle 7 and the Panther at Cologne Cathedral continues to be told 8 decades after the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared from the streets of a shattered city on the banks of the Rhine,